Hello and welcome to another installment of the Weird Chronicles. Each episode, we bring you tales of action and adventure from Malifaux and the other side. Today's story takes place on Chugmugs Eve, a night when gremlins from all over the bayou gather around the Chugmugs tree to drink shine and make merry. It's one of the only times that the clans put down their weapons and put a temporary halt to their feuding. So when the sanctity of Chugmugs is threatened, the consequences can be very dire indeed. I hope you enjoy The True Meaning of Chugmugs.
The True Meaning of Chugmugs by Mike Wallace. Snow fell over the bayou, lazy tufts of frozen white dancing in microcurrents of air. The sight would be downright peaceful earthside. On Malifaux, the calm had a nervous edge. A tension like just before a hidden predator strikes. Cloaked by snow, and lit by the fickle glow of Malifaux's twin moons, the airship Infamy hung over the bayou, anchor lines tangled in the foliage below. The armoured airship, the only one of its kind in all Malifaux, was enormous. In the Infamy's hangar bay was a row of what could only be described as flying contraptions. While some looked like mechanical versions of the bayou's giant skeeters, others were less insectoid. Each had a small patch of coloured cloth wrapped somewhere behind the saddle. Seated next to one was a young and unhappy-looking gremlin in a pair of mechanics' waders that were held up with gator-hide suspenders. Cleats wiped an old oily rag over the abdomen of the iron skeeter. It was polished so clean that he could see his reflection in its surface. The Meire Cleats glared back at him, so he snorted through his teeth and hocked a wad of phlegm at it. "I hate Chugmugs," he said in a low voice. The silence in the hangar hung indifferent. "I hate Chugmugs," he bellowed. There was a shuffle behind him. Cleat's brother Buck was staring at a toolbox. He had been thinking so hard that it had made him go cross-eyed. He stood up with a stretch. "Was that Cleats?" "Every year, Buck. Every year it's the same. Guard the loot, Cleats. Take these death threats to the city, Cleats. And now it's polished the skeeters, Cleats. Ho, ho, ho." He kicked the iron skeeter and let out a chain of cusses as pain shot up his foot. "Captain gave us a job," Buck argued. He held up the toolbox. "He says I got to alphabetise these here toolboxes." Cleats glared at him. "You can't even alphabet, dummy. I got all the brains, you just got the teeth." Buck whistled through the chompers Mum had named him after. "We got to work, though. If we don't do it, Burns will tell on us, and then the captain'll feed us to—" He looked around quick and lowered his voice. "The first mate." "The first mate's keeping his eye on Burns. If Burns has any brains in his big pink head, he'll be keeping his eye on the first mate." Cleats rubbed his hand over the flat part of his face, where a human would have a nose. "I'm sick of being just a cabin boy and taking captain's orders, especially when it means we're not allowed to go to Chugmugs." Buck smacked his lips. "Would be nice if we could wet our whistle. Ain't right leaving us with nary a drop of shine in the whole ship," Cleat said. He absently produced a small flask, drank from it, and tucked it away. "Cleaning and polishing the flying machines, feeding the first mate. Well, everyone else gets to celebrate, it ain't right." "I remember our first Chugmugs," Buck said. "All the bottles stashed neat like under the still. Bacon for breakfast. The adults let us have a sip of the brewmaster's North Wind Bite." Cleat sighed. "I can't remember a thing after that." The brothers smiled, but then Cleat scowled and kicked the skeeter again, this time with the ball of his foot. No. I ain't putting up with this any more. If we can't have Chugmugs, then no one will. Buck gasped. I mean it, Cleats insisted. He wrung his hands together and smiled. No one will get a drop. We're gonna steal Chugmugs. There weren't many parts of the bayou that were considered to be sacred ground for the gremlins. Old Lady Zoraida's hut was one, but that deference came more from the desire to keep one's life than anything else. But Chugmugs was a gremlin holiday, and over time the gremlin families had created their own special spot for it, under the Chugmugs tree. The tree was one of the tallest and thickest in the bayou. It was made up of several trunks, all of which were tangled together like a big, inebriated octopus. Tonight, the tops of the branches were covered with a light blanket of snow. At the base of the tree was a clearing, spreading out in about 100 feet in every direction. Because it was Chugmug's Eve, the clearing was filled with wagons, tents, and makeshift pig pens for the morning's feast. The party was in full swing as Cleats and Buck arrived on the iron skeeters they'd borrowed from their boss. A great din came from the clearing as they looked for a clear spot to land. It was a chaotic mess made up of voices, laughter, singing, the occasional gunshot, and cheers as the gremlins engaged in different Chugmug's Eve events. These included classics like Chase the Pig, Pin the Tail on the Pig, and Don't Get Ate by the Pig. In the center of the clearing, right in front of the Chugmug's tree, a massive bonfire burned, and the gremlins gathered around it rotated an enormous wicker cage that held a fat, panicking sow. Younger gremlins basted hot grease on the pig and each other, but it was still early and only a few had caught fire so far. On the east side of the clearing was an old rectangular building made from brick and wood that seemed strangely untouched by the swamp. Cleats brought his skeeter down east of the clearing, next to a wagon that some Chugmug's partygoer had abandoned. Buck landed his skeeter next to Cleats' purloined machine and leapt down to kiss the dirt. "Oh, thank goodness," Buck claimed. "I hate flying." "You live on an airship, dummy. Now keep it quiet." "But Cleats," Buck implored, "you can't really mean to steal Chugmugs. Think about how sad everyone would be if they came all this way and didn't get any shine. Not to mention what they'd do if they found out it was us." "Well, they ain't gonna find out, will they?" Cleat said. "I'm not leaving without every drop of shine." He grabbed Buck by his ear and pulled him along the side of the old brick building. A pair of big barn doors faced away from the celebration, and together they managed to slide one open and slip inside without making a sound. The interior was spacious and filled with rows of wooden barrel racks, some of which had lit lanterns hanging from them. The floor was designed with inclines and ramps that led up to the doors they'd entered through. In the center of the room was a massive copper still, curvy at the bottom with a narrow neck like a big swan. The fire underneath it was lit, and the bubbling concoction within filled the air with the smell of brewing moonshine. The two brothers tasted the air. "You taste that?" Cleats asked. "That's north wind bite," Buck whispered. He frowned and went cross-eyed again. Cleats, where's all the bottles? Ain't there supposed to be bottles next to the still?" Cleats looked around. "I guess for a party this big they didn't bring bottles. They brought barrels." Indeed, wooden barrels were arranged in small groups all throughout the building. Each was branded with a different gremlin clan mark. "The grinning teeth ones must belong to the Joneses," Cleat said. "And the crossed guns are the Lacroix." "I recognise Ma Tucket's spoon on them ones," Buck said with a shudder. "And a pigtail for the Turners." "What about that one?" Buck asked. Cleats looked over a single barrel that had been adorned with a variety of paper stars and firecrackers. That doesn't look like shine. He frowned. Must be some surprise for the celebration. Hey, there's the captains, Buck said, pointing to a trio of metal oil drums with a big lightning bolt painted on them. He licked his lips. I could sure go for a drink right about now. Cleats wanted to argue it, but the coast seemed to be clear. Couldn't hurt. Which one do we sample? Buck looked around and then smiled. Cleats. In one corner of the distillery were 8 large barrels, the biggest and nicest looking barrels in the building. They were made from cherry wood by the colour. They were unmarked, but the 2 brothers smiled. Brewmaster's finest, they said in unison. They stalked towards the treasure, drooling at the prospect. Oink. Both gremlins froze. Cleats? Yeah, Buck. Did I oink? No. Did you? They exchanged glances, then looked behind them. The biggest boar they'd ever seen stood behind them, with tusks like bullhorns and a leathery hide covered in branding scars. It sniffed the air and exhaled so hard that the gremlin's ears flopped. Then it charged. Cleats and Buck screamed, turned, and ran, right into each other. Their heads bonked together, and they fell onto their backs. The fall saved them, as the boar charged right over them, its hooves barely missing some painful areas. It came to a sudden stop a dozen feet away, confused as to why it wasn't covered in gremlin guts. Cleats opened his eyes and patted himself down. Buck was still screaming, even though he hadn't been injured either. Cleats smacked him, and then the 2 of them scrambled to their feet and raced towards the barrel racks. They scrambled up a rack of empty barrels as fast as they could and squeezed into the shadows near the ceiling. The boar spun around, sniffed the air, and followed their scent back to where they were hiding. Snorting with rage, it reared up, put its front hooves on the rack, and tried to knock the whole rack over, gremlins and all. The west entrance to the distillery, the one facing the Chugmugs party, opened, and a female gremlin's voice rang out. Patches, what are you getting into? The 2 gremlins peeked out and saw a gremlet saunter towards the boar. She was wearing a frilly dress that was twice her size, strapped down with leather belts. She'd dolled up her hair in a big beehive and had smeared some kind of red, waxy substance all over her lips. Buck went cross-eyed as he adopted a faraway look. She's beautiful. But she's going to get ate. Cleat stuffed his fist into Buck's mouth. Shut it. That's Luda May, one of my Tuckett's nieces. If she catches us, we're dead. Buck struggled, but Cleats held him down firmly. Luda May swished across the room to confront the boar, who turned on her and let out an angry whine. Don't you give me no back talk, Luda May snapped. She drew a long metal rod from her hip and waved it at the pig. I'm in charge of you, and you's gonna learn your place. Patches let out a squeal of panic and backed up into the barrel rack, making the whole thing wobble. Luda May waved the iron rod like she was fencing, herding Patches away from the barrels and toward the back of the building, where a makeshift pen of wooden fencing and heavy chains had been erected. Won't drink the hooch, he said. Luda May muttered. What was he thinking? Never met a pig who didn't want to drink every drop of shine in sight. The pig glanced sideways, as if seeking an escape route, and she jabbed it in the neck with the rod. You stay in your pen. If I catch you snorting around the brewmaster's barrels again, I'll put this brand where the sun don't shine. Patches scrambled into the pen and squatted down. It let out a tentative whine. Luda May glared, but her posture softened. Oh, you sad little thing. Maybe I can go get you some ham. Would you like that? Patches stood up again, practically bouncing on its hooves. Yeah, you want some ham? Let me go get you some ham. Luda May turned and left, her dress trailing out behind her. Cleats rubbed his chin. That's a brander, he said. All them scars on Patches. Looks like she put the fear of it into him. Buck licked Cleat's hand, forcing his brother to yank his fist out of Buck's mouth. Coughing, Buck cast a weary glance toward the pig. We can't even get near the shine now. Think about it, dummy, Cleat said. We just got to get that iron off Luda May. Then we can boss Patches around like she does. How are we going to get it? Cleat shrugged. You said she was pretty. Go bamboozle her with your charisma, then grab the poker when she's distracted. But Cleats booted Buck off the rack, and his brother plummeted to the floor, hitting hard enough to send up a cloud of dust. Patches growled in his pen. He paced back and forth, conflicted between instinct and his master's command. Buck picked himself up, coughing again. He gave Cleats a wounded look, but Cleats just waved him towards the door. Eyes on Patches, Buck headed for the door. It swung open just as he reached it, smacking him in the face. Luda May came back in, dragging a heavy burlap sack behind her. She let out a scream of surprise as Buck stumbled out from behind the door, and she swung the sack like a club, clobbering Buck and knocking him on his rump. Sweet snappers, don't you scare me like that! Luda May cried. She shut the door behind her. Who the heck are you? What are you doing in the still? You trying to steal shine for tomorrow? I'll knock those big ugly teeth out of your head. No, I'm not stealing nothing, Buck insisted, waving his arms in surrender. Then what are you doing in here? Are you the reason why Patches is all riled up? Sorry, Buck said. Honest I am. I'm with Captain Zip's crew. I was just tending his barrels, honest. That buzzhead brought his offering hours ago. I don't like liars. She raised her hand as if preparing to backhand the fallen gremlin. Honest, Buck says. He says to me, Buck, you's got to add the secret ingredient when I tells you to. You's got to uphold the honour of the iron skeeters. Luda May's frown softened a bit. Secret ingredient? What secret ingredient? It's a secret. I don't know what it is. Smells powerful like engine degreaser, though. Luda May's gaze wavered. You telling the truth? I am, I swear it. She pursed her lips and stepped back, letting Buck get to his feet. Thank you, Mom, he babbled. Sorry for startling you. It was a surprise to me, too, seeing you. You're very pretty. Luda May grinned a bit, but she made a chewing motion to hide it. You're just saying that. No, I'm telling it how it is, Buck insisted. You're as pretty as any gremlin could dream of. Ain't you a charmer? Do you like my dress? Got it off a human wagon. She turned in place, letting the long skirt swish past Buck's face, which blossomed into a very dumb grin. Yes, Ma'am. She stopped her twirl and took a step towards him. What about my hair? Pretty as sunshine. She stepped in close to Buck, her eyes aflutter. And my lipstick? It matches your eyes. Barely blushing, Luda May scratched the bottom of his chin with one finger. Well, maybe you ain't as dumb as you look. Then she spotted Buck's hand reaching around her hip. Now, to Cleat's thinking, Buck had put on a solid performance. His brother wasn't much for thinking, but stress seemed to bring some manner of wit to his surface. It seemed to him that Buck was about to snatch the branding iron that hung from her belt, and that she'd be none the wiser. But to Luda May's perspective, one that had plenty of experience dealing with gremlin boys, it looked more like Buck was reaching for something else entirely. So she did what any sensible gremlin woman would do. She reared back and headbutted him right in the face. Buck went back on his rump and let out a yelp of surprise. "Why, you no good two-timing backstabbing pea-brained little pug-butt!" Luda May shrieked. She hefted the sack of ham and spun it over her head like a mace. "I'll flatten you!" Buck did what any sensible gremlin would do in such a situation. He squealed and hurled himself to his feet as the burlap sack full of meat came down on the ground, barely missing his skull. Unperturbed, Luda May gave chase, shouting all manner of obscenities. Buck rushed around a stack of barrels, only to find Patches standing on his hind legs, the front perched up against the side of the pen so as to let the pig get a better look at all the commotion. Buck screamed, ducked, and ran under the boar's head. When Luda May next swung at him with her ham mace, the blow struck the boar instead of him, impaling the sack on his tusks. "Oops, sorry, Patches," she shouted as she rushed past him. Patches gave his big head a shake, dislodging the ham, and tore into it with his big teeth. Luda May didn't pause to watch. She caught up with Buck and booted him hard enough to launch him airborne. Looking around for another weapon, she snatched up an old steel pipe and brandished the long copper tube like a sword. "Come here, you rotten little grubber!" Buck crawled under racks and over barrels as Luda May stalked after him with contempt. When Buck ran out of obstacles to dart around, he wedged himself into a corner, his eyes darting every which way in search of an escape route. Luda May advanced on him, her knuckles almost white around the pipe in her hands. "I'll teach you to go for the reach round." Lifting the pipe above her head, she swung it at Buck's head. Buck dove between her legs and under her dress. Then, blinded by the billowing dress, he panicked and started scrambling in every direction. Luda May let out a shout of surprise, then a sharp gasp. Her eyes went redder than a skeeter bite. "You pig!" She swung the pipe down at the squirming gremlin in her dress and connected with something that made Buck go oomph. He jerked to one side, pulling on the dress and bringing Luda May down in a tangle of arms and legs, and her enormous dress. There was a great ripping sound, and then Buck broke free, clutching his bottom with both hands as he ran, leaving Luda May with nothing but tatters and straps. Her beehive had fallen apart around her shoulders and was hanging down to her hips. I'm sorry! Buck wheezed over and over. He went straight for the exit, yanked it open, and ran out into the party. Luda May paused to tighten the belt so that the ruins of her dress would at least keep her presentable. Then she stormed after him, practically foaming at the mouth with an endless string of cursing that would have put a blush on a brothel. She charged out the door, slamming it shut behind her. But it did nothing to muffle the cacophony of surprised laughter and catcalls coming from outside. The distillery became very quiet, save for a few choking sounds. Cleats had shoved his fist into his own mouth to keep himself from breaking down in guffaws. Then his eyes fell on the branding iron, dropped and forgotten on the floor, where Buck and Luda May had fought. He grinned from ear to ear. Wary of Patches, Buck climbed down and snatched up the brand. Then he sneaked up behind the boar, which was gnawing on a ham bone. "Hey, Patches!" The boar spun, tusks gleaming. Then he spotted the branding iron in Cleat's hand and shuddered. "Yeah, that's right," Cleats chortled. "Hiss, squeal, piggy." Patches whined. Cleats could see the whites of the pig's eyes, but also the anger in them. If he made one misstep, Patches would gore him to death without a second thought. He jabbed and he threatened, herding Patches back to the far side of its pen. No more ham for you. Cleets chuckled, turning his back to the cowering pig. That ought to teach you who's in charge here. At last, the distillery was his. He rubbed his hands. Barrels and barrels of shine, all his. But how to escape with it? Cleets had been anticipating bottles which he could just put in a sack and fly off with. He'd need something substantially bigger if he was going to carry the barrels away. An idea came to him, and a sudden wicked grin split his green face in two. After several minutes of straining, Cleets managed to swing the doors open and push the abandoned wagon into the distillery. He found a wooden plank that was big enough to prop up against the back of the wagon, so all he had to do was push the barrels up the makeshift ramp and into the wagon. The brewmaster's barrels went first, and after some consideration he decided the Joneses had the next best shine. The wagon was soon full. Would he be able to make 2 trips? He only knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to take the barrel covered in firecracker pictures. He worked as quietly as he could, but neither Buck nor Luda May returned. Cleet suspected that Buck had gotten a right thrashing by the vindictive gremlin woman. Whenever he passed Patch's pen, the pig squealed, growled, and kicked the crude fencing. The more Cleets took, the angrier Patches got. "Ah, shut it, dummy," he said. He climbed the fence of her pen and jabbed at the pig with the branding iron. "This stupid thing ain't even hot. But look at you, ratting coward." Patches growled back at him. "You think I'm scared? You're nothing but a lily-livered stinker. I've half a mind to put this up your nut." Patches reared up and yanked the branding iron from Cleets's hand with its teeth. Looking Cleets dead in the eye, Patches bit down and snapped the steel rod in 2. A tense silence followed. "Well..." Patches let out a snort of pure rage. With single charge, it barreled right through the fence, chains and all. Cleets landed on his back, but managed to roll away and flee to the center of the room, near the still. The firelight blazed in Patch's pitiless black eyes. He stomped the ground, prepping for another charge. Cleets looked for an escape, but the boar was between him and the wagon. He'd have to distract it to... With a roar, Patches charged forward, his tusks lowered to impale Cleets through the gut. He dove to the side, kicking up dust as Patches skidded to a halt, just short of barreling into the bubbling still. It flipped around, snorted, and gave chase, quickly gaining ground on the fleeing gremlin. Cleets felt a tusk hook under his breeches, and suddenly he was airborne, flying over Captain Zip's oil drums. He collided with the firecracker barrel, knocking it over. It rolled away as the lid came loose, leaving a trail of coloured paper and black gunpowder. Patches came around the metal drums. It stalked slowly towards Cleets, who crawled backwards until he was pressed up against one of the barrel racks. Fire reflected in the boar's eyes as it continued forward, only stopping when its snout was inches from Cleets' face. Death wasn't anything special to gremlins. Heck, Cleets and Buck were the only 2 to survive their litter. But staring into those big nostrils, Cleets felt the impending end of his own existence. He never thought much about death, save that, in a fair universe, he'd have liked to have gone out with a bang. Patches backed up in preparation for his final lunge at the annoying gremlin, and his rump bumped into a nearby table, knocking the lantern on top of it to the ground. The lantern shattered, right on the trail of spilled gunpowder. With a hiss, the gunpowder ignited, spitting sparks and smoke as it blazed a trail towards the firecracker barrel, which had come to rest near the bubbling moonshine still. in a distillery full of high-proof moonshine. Cleats and Patches exchanged glances, and they ran. With speed born of panic, Patches hurled himself through the main entrance. Screams broke out from the partygoers outside as the huge boar stampeded through and over partygoers. Cleats knew that he'd never be able to escape on foot. He had to fly. Instead of running for the door, he ran for the wagon. He leapt onto the wagon's bench, grabbed the leather reins and yanked. The reins, which had been tied to the 2 iron skeeters that Cleats and Buck had borrowed from the infamy, pulled the levers on the backs of the flying contraptions, bringing them to life. Wings buzzing, the iron skeeters slowly began to hover and pull the wagon forward. "Come on! Come on!" Cleats cried. He twisted and yanked at the reins, forcing the skeeters to move forward, but they were barely moving. It hadn't occurred to Cleats until that moment that the skeeters hadn't been designed to pull anything behind them, let alone a heavy wagon full of moonshine. With a squeal, he tossed the reins aside and climbed onto the leftmost skeeter to look over the controls. Maneuvering sticks, altitude adjusters. There, the big red button. Behind him, the hissing gunpowder went quiet. Cleats dared to look back and saw that the firecracker barrel was now on fire. He screamed, gripped the skeeter with both legs, and hit the red button. The back end of the skeeter ignited, spewing a geyser of hot flame long as Cleats' arm. The skeeter shot forward and upward, yanking it, its brother skeeter, and the wagon off the ground. A few barrels bounced off the back of the wagon, but Cleats couldn't be bothered to think about it. He held on for dear life, his face rippling with the force of the acceleration. Just as he cleared the bayou's canopy, the distillery exploded behind him. The shock wave sent him flying up into the air, only for the still accelerating wagon to slam into him, forcing the hard wood of the bench against his back. He felt himself falling and scrambled to grab the dangling reins to stop himself. By sheer luck, the twisted reins caught a lever on the rocket-propelled skeeter, cutting its rocket engine and dropping back into ordinary flight mode. The wagon tilted dangerously, but with a bit of maneuvering and a lot of begging, he managed to keep the skeeters flying fast enough to stay more or less upright. He turned the wagon around and landed it as softly as he could, the barrels bouncing and sloshing behind him. When he was safely grounded, Cleats jumped to his feet and let out a hoot of joy. "You're gosh darn right. Take that, Patches. Take that, Captain Zip. Take that, Chugmugs. I got your shine. I got you still. Who's laughing now? See how you like it when you ain't got a drop to drink this year." Cleats took a moment to catch his breath and still his pounding heart. Once he was certain he was still alive, he listened to the swamp around him, his ears perking up. He wanted to hear the anger, the fury, the scramble of gremlins who'd just been hoodwinked in a raid more daring than anything Captain Zip had ever pulled. He craned his neck, leaning out of the wagon to listen closely. He didn't hear rage. He didn't hear shouting or gunshots or cussing. To his great confusion, he heard something that he'd never heard before. Gremlins crying. Sobbing, really. Young and old, male and female. They were all shocked, horrified and grief-stricken. Cleats blinked. He'd done it. He'd ruined Chugmugs. He sank down into the bench of the wagon, the fire in his belly snuffed out. The world reeled around him as the weight of what he'd done settled down on his shoulders. "I didn't mean it," he whispered. "I just wanted you to be mad like I was mad. I didn't want you to get killed, but I didn't want everyone." He swallowed. Sober. The word sent a chill down his spine and a needle through his heart. He'd stolen everyone's shine, and now the still explosion had shocked every gremlin present stone-cold sober. Doesn't feel right, does it? Cleet saw a hunched figure step out of the shadows. He was clad in black robes that concealed his face, but he was still recognizable at a glance. The brewmaster. He looked up at Cleet's with calm, unreadable eyes. The eyes bulged in Cleet's face. The brewmaster sighed. Did you know that Chugmugs isn't really that old of a holiday? I should know, of course. I started it. The brewmaster climbed up into the wagon beside him. Do you know why I created Chugmugs, young one? Cleet shook his head. He had only heard stories about the brewmaster, and he didn't quite know what to make of a living legend. Because gremlins like to bicker, the brewmaster answered. Once upon a time, that was fine. But these days, we have to stick together. Humans. Neverborn. Those people who seek to manipulate us for their own ends. The older gremlin sighed. Now, more than ever, we gremlins have to watch out for one another. Chugmugs isn't going to do it, not by itself. But it's a start. Once a year, the families of the bayou come together and share cups. We don't fight, at least not in any meaningful way. Nothing makes this old gremlin's heart rest easier than seeing his people come together and sharing shine. Cleets blinked, feeling tears run down his face. They're all sober. The brewmaster nodded. Sad that. They're likely to start fighting soon. Stop blaming each other, remembering that they hate each other. Then Chugmugs won't mean a thing. I'm sorry, Cleet said. His voice sounded a youngling's, but he didn't care. I ruined everything. I'm sorry. Well, it is something to be sorry about, Brewmaster said. But it seems to me that not all is lost. No? The brewmaster glanced back at the wagon's cargo. 7, 8, 12. Maybe just enough. Cleets eyed the barrels, then looked at the brewmaster. You mean there might be enough to save the day? Just maybe. He winked at the younger gremlin. Cleets wiped his eyes, sniffed, and yanked the reins with both hands. It took a moment, but the iron skeeters eventually managed to get enough momentum going to lift the wagon off the ground. Well now, isn't this a thing? The brewmaster murmured as he peered over the side of the wagon at the marshland racing underneath them. Gee up now, Cleet called. Cleet steered the skeeters up over the canopy and down into the clearing. The damage was severe. Most of the tents had been blasted away by the explosion, and the distillery was nothing but a flattened black smudge. Gremlin shuffled about in a daze of confusion, grief, and dawning sobriety. Hey! A gremlin child called out as he pointed up at the flying wagon. Hey, look! Cleets manoeuvred the skeeter wagon in for a landing. Smooth as good shine, it touched the ground and rolled to a stop. The gremlins gathered around them, the largest of their number shoving their way to the front of the mob. Cleet sank into his seat, but the brewmaster stood up straight. Well, we've had quite the night, he said. The crowd shuffled, and a big gremlin Cleets recognized as Sommerteeth Jones emerged, a blackened top hat perched askew on his fat head. What's happening here? The still. Yes, Brewmaster said, shaking his head. It is a tragedy, but it was an old still. Who here hasn't suffered the same? A few heads bobbed in agreement. But Sommer sucked in a breath. "But all the shine! Chugmugs is ruined!" He huffed and chewed on the cigar sticking out of his mouth. "Not quite, Sommer, my boy." The brewmaster patted one of the barrels on the wagon. "I had a feeling that we would be needing more moonshine. So I had this young fellow here fetch a few barrels." All eyes fell on Cleats. "Cleats!" Captain Zip pushed his way forward. "What are you doing with my skeeters? I'll have you fed to the first mate as a Chugmugs feast, I—" The brewmaster silenced the sky pirate with a raised hand. Everyone gasped, because to their knowledge they had never heard Zip shut up, ever. "This young man just saved Chugmugs," the brewmaster declared. "But you're in shock, I understand. I think that after you've had a cup of my north wind's bite, you'll feel a bit better." He broke open a barrel, and soon everyone was too caught up in the prospect of getting a cup of the brewmaster's creations to care about anything else. Cleat squeezed his way out of the crowd and bumped right into Buck. He threw his arms around his brother. "You're alive! What's all over your face? Where's Luda May?" Buck's face was covered with red smudges. Luda May sauntered up behind him and planted a smooch on his cheek, leaving another distinct mark from her lipstick. "Hey, Cleats," Buck said, his voice dreamy. We had a little disagreement," Luda May said, "but we worked things out." "Yeah," Buck said. Cleats could only stare at his brother. "Come on, Bucky Poo," Luda May said. "After all this excitement, I need something to take the edge off." "Come in, Luddykins," Buck called as he scampered after her. Cleats watched them go with a blank, dumb expression. After everything that had happened, that had been the cherry on the top of, well, something. The party picked up again. Gremlins were clinking mugs and laughing, loudly describing how amazing the still explosion was, and how most of them were looking forward to next year's explosion. Most of them couldn't hear out of one or both ears anymore, so there was lots of shouting and requests for people to repeat themselves. Someone pressed a mug of clear shine into Cleat's hand, and he saw Captain Zip wink at him before slipping back into the crowd, already bragging about his flying machines to a dumbfounded Tucket boy. Cleats took a long breath and smiled as he saw so many of his kin brought back into a pleasant state of inebriation. This is how it should be, he thought. The brewmaster was right. Chugmugs was about more than hooch. It was about being friendly. And the hooch. He lifted his glass to his lips. Sommer Teeth Jones's voice boomed out over the crowd, stilling everyone to silence. "Wait a gosh dang minute! These are my barrels!"
That's it for another episode of the Weird Chronicles. Join us next time for more tales of action and adventure.